Hi everyone, my name is Guangyu, you can call me Frank. This is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2020 meetings of the Society for Mathematics Psychology. Today I'd like to talk about something about questionnaire. Firstly, let's take a look at some pictures. So here come the questions. Have you seen these patterns in your data? If your answer is yes, unfortunately I have to say that these patterns may affect your data analysis. This pattern is called response bias. It refers to the cases whereby respondents favor certain response options over others. According to the position of field options, response bias can be distinguished into midpoint response bias, the tendency to use midpoints, extreme response bias, the tendency to use extreme responses, and the quiescent response bias, the tendency to use the positive side of one item. Response bias was caused by both respondent factors and context-dependent factors. Respondent factors include personality and cultural influence, while the context-dependent factors include survey setting, lack of knowledge, and social desirability. Response bias is assumed to be independent from measure traits and thus contributes to the error variance. Prior studies have shown that the group difference comparison, correlation coefficient, regression coefficient, and factor loadings change remarkably after controlling for response bias. This result raised the necessity to control response bias. But on the other hand, this result was criticized to be hindsight because the conclusions were made after correction. Some researchers opposed to controlling response bias in data analysis because they failed to find any substantial changes after the correction. Hence, the aim of this talk is to clarify the controversy and assess the impact of response bias on our studies. So first, let's take a look at our simulation study. This study was used to explore the influence of response bias on mean variance. There are two samples for each condition, the normal samples and the response bias samples. The response bias samples, 10% of responses was first generated as response bias and then added to the samples. The average was the position of the sample mean and size of the sample variance, and the deviation was the quantity and the ratio of variance between normal samples and response bias samples. The former was used to estimate the influence of response bias on mean, while the latter was used to estimate the influence on variance. A key finding is that the influence of response bias on mean variance is inconsistent across conditions. In other words, when response bias has a smaller effect on mean, there rarely is a greater effect on variance, vice versa. Prior studies which oppose to controlling response bias tend to ignore the influence of response bias on variance. However, response bias, especially extreme response bias, can remarkably change our sample distribution shape, which cause heteroscedasticities or even make the mean less meaningful. And thus, we argue that people may underestimate the contaminating effect of response bias. This argument was later supported by our World Value Survey study. In World Value Survey study, we first chose two countries, Belarus and Libya. The reason why we chose them is because they show the highest middle response bias and extreme response bias tendency. Through the comparison between them, we want to show that how culture influences people's response bias choice and how such influence developed our studies. We selected one item V131. It asks how people agree that government-tested reach is an essential characteristic of democracy. The distributions of both countries on V131 is shown below. As you can see, these two samples were differently distributed, but their mean is quite close. Response bias can result in similar mean but different variance. In that sense, compare the mean of these samples make no sense. After removing people with high response bias tendency, the distributions looks more similar. Hence, here comes the conclusions. The presence of response bias significantly threatens our measurement validities and equivalence, and thus it is necessary to take response bias into account. However, different from prior papers, we suggest that researchers should bring the corrections forward before fitting a model. Some preventions can be done when developing our skills, for instance, including donor options or set up more response categories. The preventions can promote people to specify their responses and thus inhibit the tendency to use response bias. Additionally, for those who have finished the data collection, middle inflation model, ART model, and the latent class factor model is recommended. Okay, that's all the content, and thanks for your listening.